Ever since games could do more than draw 2 rectangles and a square to simulate ping pong, they've been telling stories with varying levels of complexity. Some of the most popular games of all time are lauded for their iconic characters and immersive worlds. In recent years, we've seen an aim towards more cinematic experiences, attempting to create and deliver stories that are more compelling, whilst also trying to tone down the importance of gameplay more and more. And nowhere is this more prevalent than in what I like to call narrative games. To draw a connection to movies, these are the art house films of gaming. They're trying to do something different from the mainstream approaches to their medium. Instead of action-packed gameplay or interesting mechanics to engage the player, we get a lot of expository voiceovers, visual symbolism, and reading. Always reading. Lots and lots and lots of reading. Narrative games come in all shapes and sizes. From walking simulators to platformers to new age point-and-clicks, the way you play these games is always different, but always interesting. Not necessarily good, but interesting. The problem is, these games don't exactly have that much interactivity. In a lot of the walking simulators, you're just walking, picking up objects and reading notes. In the new age point and clicks, you're kind of just sifting through dialogue options mid-cutscene. There's the odd puzzle here and there, but for the most part it's just selecting dialogue options until you solve the puzzle. This lack of even remotely complex interactivity has resulted in more than a few people stating that these narrative games aren't exactly games. Case in point, Her Story. This is a game about trying to solve a crime by reviewing interview footage that you can search for via this Windows 3.0 style interface. It's an interesting approach to non-linear storytelling, and it leaves the conclusion up to the player. All you're really doing in this game is watching footage and then flexing your vocabulary muscles to search for more footage and learn more of the story. The gameplay is very limited. There are very few systems to interact with, almost to the point where you could argue this could have just been a movie. And it's got some people going as far as to, again, say this is not a game. While I don't agree with these people, they're kind of right. Not because their opinion is correct, but because video game isn't exactly a rigid definition for this medium. See, literature is defined as words on pages. Simple enough. Film is a series of still images. Easy. But video games are defined simply as games on a screen. And the problem lies right there. Games. Game is a rather tough concept to define. It's been stumping philosophers for decades now, and really no one can agree on the topic. We know what isn't a game. Books aren't games. Movies aren't games. Watching paint dry isn't a game, unless that's something you enjoy, but we can't really decide on what is a game. By some definitions, a game has to be fun, it has to have conflict, it has to have a goal. And by these very same definitions, some things that we refer to as games aren't actually games. By one set of definitions, SimCity technically isn't a game, it's a toy. By another set of definitions, Minecraft wasn't a game before they chose to add the Ender Dragon. If we argue that something like Depression Quest, as terrible as it is somehow not a game because of its lack of interactive mechanics, then we're also saying that some of the classic MUDs that started PC gaming and those visual novels that people love for some reason aren't games. What I think these naysayers tend to forget is that video games are considered art. Legally, anyways. That means that anything that isn't considered a video game because it lacks some set of non-standardized criteria is suddenly not covered by the same legal precedent as an artistic piece. Saying something like Gone Home isn't a game and therefore not legally a piece of art, but Call of Duty Ghosts somehow is legally art? That's a little ridiculous. These narrative games have told stories and made me feel things that almost no other artistic work has in any medium. The emotional connections I had to the characters in the first season of The Walking Dead were personal and seemingly real, and the story was told in a way that only video games could tell. I was the one that felt those emotions, not just the characters in the game. My choices dictated the events that transpired. It was one of the first times I really felt a strong connection to characters in a video game. Similarly, The Novelist made me feel this intense sense of anxiety. I was the one who had to decide the fate of this family and make choices that could impact their lives forever. Even though the choices really didn't matter, but that's besides the point. To imply that games like these, ones that evoke a real sense of emotion in the player, somehow aren't deserving of being called games because of their lack of game criteria, is to argue that they don't deserve legal protection as a work of art. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that narrative games are the only way to deliver interesting stories in this medium. The reason I fell in love with BioShock wasn't because of its clunky controls and terrible binary moral choice system. I fell in love with it because of the world it presented and the story it told. The environments were beautiful and presented a story not only through the visuals, but also through the expository voiceovers. The same things that dragged me and so many others into that game are some of the same things that these narrative games are doing. Well, the ones that aren't just text. The fact that this is something people are even discussing is laughable. Video games aren't part of some special club where only the elite get to enter. Some of the most terrible collections of complete trash are still considered video games, no matter how broken. So how are we going to accept Ride to Hell Retribution as a game, but not something that pushes the medium's artistic abilities forward? Of the list of issues narrative games have, the discussion of whether they're games or not is probably the least important. They're overpriced, overpraised, overhyped, and their creators are typically whiny art students that are disconnected from the realities of the gaming world. Arguing over whether or not they fit a set of non-existent criteria is one of the last things we should even be bothering with. At the end of the day, whether or not these narrative games are games is redundant. Some games that are considered classics aren't even games if you want to get super technical about it. What's important is that these narrative games are meaningful. They mean just as much to this medium as any action or grand strategy game does. To deny them the artistic legalities of being video games is just flat out stupid. I don't even really like these kinds of games, but I can appreciate them for what they are. As much as I didn't like Her Story, it's still a testament to the abilities that video games have to tell a story in a way that no other medium can. As much as I don't like Sunset, it's still a decent enough game that tells a story that may interest some people. Not everything has to be full of combat or full of brain-busting puzzles in order to be considered a game. Maybe instead of arguing over whether they're games or not, we should be focusing on the fact that a game made by one guy told a story in a way that no amount of gigantic, sprawling open worlds and AAA multi-million-dollar budgets ever has.
The trail. Take us back, oh, take us back, oh.